When we're choosing harvest weed seed control techniques, we need to consider the nutrient implications of each technique. Firstly, we have tools that focus on the chaff and the straw. So this is narrow windrow burning and the bale direct system. So with these systems, they remove 40 to 50% of the crop residue, whereas there are other systems which just remove the chaff residue only. So all of the ones that remove just the chaff, we're talking about removing between 10 and 30% of the residue from the field, and a typical figure is about 15%. And then we have the integrated Harrington seed destructor, the great benefit of which is that it doesn't remove any nutrients from the field. It destroys the weed seeds and evenly spreads the nutrients back over the field. So while it's expensive on face value for the capital cost, there is a saving in nutrient removal cost. So if we do the maths on this residue, typically a wheat crop has a harvest index of 0.4. That means that 40% of the crop's biomass is grain and the remaining 60% is residue. So for a 2-tonne wheat crop, we have 3 tonnes per hectare of residue left behind. The main nutrients in these residues are nitrogen and potassium. There are other nutrients, of course, but the big ones are nitrogen and potassium. Typical figures are that there's about 6 units of nitrogen per tonne of wheat residue and 10 units per potassium per tonne of wheat residue. These obviously vary a little bit depending on the season, but these are typical figures. When we burn narrow windrows, we know that most of that nitrogen in the residue goes up in smoke, but a lot of the potassium stays behind. So with narrow windrow burning, we take all of that residue from out wide and put it in a narrow windrow and we burn it, and we create high potassium strips and we lose the nitrogen to the atmosphere. So this means that while with the potassium from narrow windrow burning stays in the paddock, it's staying in a very narrow strip. So we have to consider that potassium that we've put in that windrow as a loss, because a lot of harvesters are now on auto steer and that those strips are going in the same place every year. So if we do the maths on all of that and work out what is the nutrient removal cost for systems that remove chaff or chaff and straw, chaff only, so we have, for every tonne of wheat yield, we have 1.5 tonnes per hectare of residue remaining. If we remove about 15% of that, then we have removed 225 kilos per hectare of residue. If we calculate how many units of potassium and nitrogen, we know that there's a total of about $4.50 per hectare of nutrients for every tonne of wheat harvested. Whereas if we look at the systems where we're removing the chaff and the straw, once again, for every tonne harvested, 1.5 tonnes per hectare of residue left behind. We remove 50% of that, so this time we're removing 750 kilos per hectare of residue, and that equates to about $15 worth of nutrients in that residue. So while we've calculated how much nutrient removal we have in straw, we know if we retain residue that not 100% of the nutrients in that residue is available to the following crop or crops. So we need to account for how much of it is available to the crop. In rough figures, we think that around 50% of the nutrients from retained stubble may be available to following crops. This is a rubbery figure, but we have to choose a figure, and we've chosen 50%. So if we use these figures, we know that when we are looking at the cost of a harvest weed seed control tool, we need to first look at the running cost of the machine. So that includes finance, fuel and maintenance and these sorts of things. And then we need to add the nutrient removal cost. So the nutrient removal cost for the tools that remove the chaff is $2.25 per tonne of wheat harvested, or for tools that remove chaff and straw, we're looking at a higher nutrient removal cost of perhaps about $7.50 per tonne of wheat harvested. Now there will be variations for other crops. Legume crops will have higher nitrogen and so on, but these are the figures for wheat harvest. And there's other benefits of retaining residue other than just purely these couple of nutrients that we've talked about. So there are residue benefits for the soil biology. Removing residue also removes some alkalinity, so there is a higher liming cost for paddocks where residue is removed. The nitrogen cycle is complex, so removing residue can reduce the nitrogen tie-up, so it can actually have a short-term benefit, but in the long term we are essentially removing nitrogen, so we have to count for that. Pre-emergent herbicide activity can be improved when we remove residue. We're able to get the herbicides on the soil more, so that can be a benefit of removing nutrients. And stubble handling at seeding is also impacted. So that sums up the nutrient implications for harvest weed seed control. All of the tools have different costs on face value. We'll talk about them in other modules of the course, but we need to add the nutrient removal to the harvest weed seed control tools to get an accurate cost of that tool.